Good evening. Thank you, Council President. Good evening, Council members. My name is Ryan Spencer. I'm the Organizational Development Manager with the Executive Services Department and had the pleasure of overseeing the 2023 Community Survey that just wrapped up a little while ago. And I'm joined tonight with Nathan Wiggin of Recon MR, and that's the consultant that the city partnered with to conduct the 2023 survey. So this is the first survey since 2017. One was queued up and ready to go in early 2020, and then the world changed. Understandably, decision was made to put that on hold, but the survey is now back and on track to be performed every other year or so. And of course, as you know, the survey results from our residents help evaluate our performance, ensure the city's priorities are still aligned with those of the community. And the feedback gathered is used to inform city leadership on various projects, programs, and budgeting decisions, helping shape the future of Renton. The 2023 survey opened immediately after Memorial Day for the 12,500 randomly selected addresses that formed the initial focus group. And then it opened up to all residents June 23rd and stayed open all the way through July 21st. Nate will be sharing the presentation, going through that with you today. You'll see a slide early in the presentation that reflects our outreach methods, but I would like to take this opportunity to extend a special thank you to the Mayor's Inclusion Task Force. We worked very closely with the task force both before the survey was opened as well as throughout the phase that it was active. Prior to the launch, we met with the community, or the task force members rather, to ensure we were asking the right questions, asked for their input on the outreach methods, and taking their recommendations, we added a couple of questions, modifying some existing ones, and also added 3 additional translations to the existing 5 that we were planning on for our marketing materials, and the survey itself would also be translated into those total 8 languages. While the survey was active, we were also able to communicate through the task force members' trusted voices in our community and encourage members that may have been less heard from in years past to participate. This was especially helpful in assuring that we were hearing from everyone in our community. Lastly, the task force members also participated in one-on-one interviews with Recon MR staff. And one last item to note, we still have space for 5 interviews to be conducted this week. If any Mayor's Inclusion Task Force members are watching tonight, please reach out to me directly and we can still get you scheduled for an interview before this Friday. Tonight's presentation will provide an excellent overall gauge of the sentiments of our community. We're working with Nate and his team to further filter some of the topic areas and individual questions, but as you'll see, many of them have already been summarized or detailed by ethnicity, age, but we'd also like to dive deeper into those, as well as we added some complexity because we wanted to see things geographically as well. For example, the walking and bicycling safety or availability and access to recreation programs. And certainly the question of your neighborhood as a place to live. We want to see that broken down by neighborhood and location. This layers add a little bit of complexity to the presentation, or not the presentation, but the dashboard. So again, Nate and his team are working through that, and we should have additional information within the next few weeks, which of course we would certainly share out to our community and to City Council. Without further delay, though, we got a lot of great information to share in the results. I'd like to introduce Nathan Wiggins of Recon MR, who will be walking us through the survey results tonight.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you, council members, for having me here. As Ryan said, I'm Nathan Wiggin. I'm with Come Engage. I'm the VP of Insights and Solutions. I'm going to give you a brief interview of me and Recon MR. So for several years, we've been known as Come Engage, a Seattle, or actually Edmonds-based firm. Earlier this year in 2023, we were acquired by Recon MR. They provide a whole powerhouse of data collection and analytics that just will help us do more for more people. As for myself, I've been in market research for nearly 20 years. Most of my time was spent here in the Seattle area with Northwest Research and then Come Engage. I've also done work for Microsoft, the University of Washington, and companies. Most of what I do, my bread and butter, is these resident or community surveys, and I primarily do them in the western U.S., Washington, Idaho, Colorado, Oregon, and various other areas. And you guys probably know the answer to this, but why are we performing a community survey? It's to set and compare benchmarks. It lets you guys see how you're doing now. And as you continue doing these in the future, it lets you compare, see where you're improving, where you may be a little stagnant, or new areas that can be improved. It helps you gauge the satisfaction of services among your residents. Not everything here is law, exact what it is. This is residents' perception of what's going on. So it helps you gauge their perception of their satisfaction, of the vision, and of the future that's going on. And we'll see some examples of this as we get into the safety section. It's also to provide data that will assist you in decision making, whether that be budgeting, setting priorities, or figuring out where and how you want to do things. You can use this to help you find out what your residents feel is important and how you can use it to improve the services you provide. We do recommend, as Ryan mentioned, doing these every 2 years, if not more often if you can. It's really nice to be able to benchmark these things, and as special topics or special events or various things come up, it's nice to be able to act quickly. There's a whole list of questions in the survey. I'm not going to go through and read all of the different topic areas, but the basic point is that we tried to cover as much as we could to try to figure out what your residents feel about a whole variety of different areas of life in Renton. And as Ryan alluded to, this was an inclusive, iterative process in terms of developing the questionnaire. We began with input from the executive leadership team. We evaluated previous surveys that we had conducted in 2015, 2017, and even the one that we had drafted to conduct in early 2020, we referenced that. We provided this information to city leadership, who provided questions and feedback, and then finally it was reviewed by the mayor and given final approval. The overall methodology, which Ryan also alluded to, was we reached out as broadly as we could within the budget we were given. So we sampled 12,500 addresses. All of them had received a letter, and you'll see a postcard, I should say, and you'll see a picture of this postcard shortly. We were sent reminders via MMS, email, and phone calls for as much as we could. As Ryan also mentioned, we conducted outreach to try to get a hold of hard-to-reach populations. The phone effort was a heck of an effort. We put in a lot more time and effort than we had in previous iterations to try to bump it up. We got 15 over the phone, but we got 652 overall. So the online response was much higher than in past, which kind of offset the lower than normal phone surveys. As Ryan mentioned, the survey was translated into 8 additional languages. There weren't very many completed in languages other than English. That's okay. This is where you begin. You have to make it available, and then we can do what we can to push it out. We had started this process several years ago in another city. The first time we did it, we got 8 surveys completed out of 700 in a language other than English. This year, we got 60. It's not perfect, it's not wonderful, but it's improvement. It's the Field of Dreams thing. Build it, then they will come. The overall margin of error for the survey is plus or minus 4%. And to put it in a very, hopefully easy to understand term, what that means when we reference the margin of error is if we were to conduct this survey 100 times using the same methodology, the address-based sample, 95 times out of 100, we're confident that the results you see would come within that plus or minus 4% that's listed in here. Really, what we use the margin of error for is to look at significant differences. This allows us to take a look at subsections of the population, tell us where there are differences in opinion, where there may not be differences of opinion. So we will call out statistical significance every once in a while as we go through this. If it's not listed in here as being statistically significant, or if we don't call it out, that generally means that we did not find anything in the data when we were doing cuts and crosstabs. And I'll give you some examples as we go through. This is an example of the outreach efforts that Ryan outlined. This is the one side of the postcard that was mailed out to the households. There's also a list of a variety of different methods that we had used, or that you guys had all used, to reach out to different residents. Ryan also mentioned that we did in-depth interviews. We had talked to 7 participants so far from the Mayor's Inclusion Task Force. We'll pull out a couple of quotes from these. We're still in the process of fully digesting the information in the transcripts. But some key themes that came out from both the interviews and from the survey that we did is that there are some genuine commitments to inclusion throughout the city. Crime is seen as problematic, and we'll dig a little deeper into that in a moment. And that downtown and Renton as a whole is improving, specifically when you're looking at the availability of small business, and there are some call outs to housing efforts being made as well. So are there any questions before we start diving into the data? Okay. So we're going to start out with a relatively high-level series of questions. The first one is we just ask people to rate their overall quality of life in Renton, whether or not it exceeds or does not exceed their expectations. And 8 out of 10 residents state, hey, the quality of life exceeds their expectations. So 8 out of 10 households in Renton say that they really have a good and high quality of life while living here. An interesting point we wanted to call out is that older residents tend to rate this higher. What we find a little interesting is that that's the inverse of what we actually see in other cities, not only in the region, but like in the Western United States where we do most of our work. We tend to find that younger residents give a slightly higher rating for overall quality of life. I have a hypothesis behind this, and we haven't had the chance to fully vet and test this hypothesis, but we'll let you know when we're done. Residents were also asked to rate their sense of community. And this is kind of a fun question because it is left to be somewhat subjective in terms of what does sense of community mean to you. We just basically ask them, hey, rate the sense of community and belonging that you have. Nearly half of the residents that were surveyed said that they feel a good sense of community in their neighborhood. So every other person that you look at says, I feel like we have a pretty good sense of community. When looked at in those terms, that's actually pretty good findings. It says that there is a good sense of community. There's room for growth. There's room to do things that improve and increase the sense of community. But there's a good starting point and baseline. I'm actually I'll go to the next slide, and then I'm going to cut ahead a couple of slides to dive in a little bit deeper onto sense of community. When we look at this, we, as I said, we cut things by age, by race. We can cut it by neighborhood and a variety of other demographics. As a general rule, the ratings are fairly consistent across the board. We did find that Black or African American residents do rate their sense of community a little bit higher. It is a statistically significant difference when compared to other groups, but overall sense of community seems to be fairly consistent across the board.
May I?
Yes.
May I? Define sense of community. Can you define sense of community? What does that mean?
I'm trying to recall the exact question wording.
But didn't you say that you purposely
We didn't give them a full-blown...
left it vague?
Yeah, we left it relatively vague. We basically said, sense of community. I'm going to paraphrase how the question goes. It means like knowing your neighbors and feeling like you're part of a community.
Thank you.
This is the first call out to a couple of quotes provided by some of the people from the Mayor's Inclusion Task Force. I'm not going to read through verbatim of the quotes, but they do talk to the sense of community and how there are differing reasons for how some people may or may not have a good sense of community. We do typically find when it comes to sense of community that older residents and or residents with children find that they have a stronger sense of community than younger residents or residents without children. That makes intuitive sense. If you've been around for a while, you know your neighbors for a while, you've lived there for a while. If you have children, you're involved in schools or children activities. So seeing that type of diversity, which is called out in here in this quote, it's what we typically see. It's what we would expect to see. This is where I'm going to skip ahead, just 2 slides to the direction that the city is headed, because this ties in with the sense of community. And this is a relatively good bright spot for the city of Renton. Typically, the sense of community, the direction that the city is headed question is viewed, more people think that it's headed in the wrong direction than in the right direction when you look at this in a lot of like fast-growing communities and communities around. In Renton, you're looking at over half say that you're heading in the right direction. So again, it's one of those things where it looks like a relatively small number. You're like, oh man, only half of the people say that we're going in the right direction. But when you put it into context of the surrounding areas and other areas across the Western US in particular, that's actually pretty high. You're seeing a large percentage of people who go, all right, it's heading in the right direction. And as a call out to the demographic differences, when we're looking at the older residents and how they tend to rate this higher, that's another one of those anomalies that we see in Renton that we don't see elsewhere. Typically what happens is the older residents and the residents who've lived in a neighborhood or a community for a long time don't like what they see in terms of change. So they feel that the community is more likely to be heading in the wrong direction. So I find it kind of interesting. And again, I have a hypothesis behind this that we're going to take a look at. And it basically involves how in tune they are with the community and how much attention they pay to community events. So let's go back a little bit to the travel. This is a series of questions that is generally asked everywhere regarding travel. You had a couple of specific ones where you're talking about like the walking and the bicycle, etc. These are pretty normal, specifically the ones when we're talking about, ease of travel via car, traveling on local roads, the light signals, etc. Your responses here are pretty much right about neutral, which is basically what you would expect people to answer when it comes to how do you like traffic. What's interesting, again, is ease of car travel in Renton is rated higher than it is elsewhere in the region. The adequacy of the local roads, traffic light timing, and connectivity to local and regional transit centers is also fairly in line with what we see around the region. What's a really cool piece, or a little cool piece of advice on room for improvement is we have been seeing this recently where people want more infrastructure for alternative modes, such as cycling and walking. We've seen this elsewhere as something that kind of comes up where people want more, that it's being shown by slightly lower scores. As an avid cyclist, yay. I like the idea of adding bike improvements, but you're seeing that people want a little bit more bicycle improvement. On the direction that the city is headed and kind of on the overall what can be improved, this is a really great quote, and I wanted to call out a couple of quick lines from it. As from one of the members of the Inclusion Task Force, there has been good work done to make Renton a great place to live and work, but it is still a work in progress. Right? It's dialectical. Two things can be true at the same time. You can be making a lot of progress, you can be doing wonderful things, and yet still recognize that there are things to improve. Right? There's increasing businesses, there's increasing housing, there's growing, there's still things that can make you better. I think that's a wonderful quote that kind of calls out, yes, it's well, but yes, we recognize we have room to improve. One of the things that adds to the sense of community in any city or township across the US is city-sponsored events or community events. And regardless of any type of race, age, gender, any type of way we can cut this, residents feel that these events build a stronger sense of community. So holding these special events, holding community-sponsored events is a great way to make people feel included, to make people feel like they are part of a community, and the residents are showing this throughout the survey and throughout their results. Another way that helps increase a sense of community or a feeling of belonging is efforts put forth by the city to inform and hear from a diverse group of populations. You're seeing that overall, Renton gets pretty high ratings here. You're getting high, on a scale of 1 to 7, right? 4 is the midpoint, 7 is high. You're typically getting results in the upper 4s, high 5s. So that basically means you're doing a good, pretty good job of doing this. You see the data looks a little bit noisy. So it kind of goes up and down a little bit when you're looking at the mean scores. Those, while they may look a little large in some cases, are generally speaking within the margin of error. So there are no statistically significant differences. The reason why you have this specific pull down and why it's not significant when talking about Native American or other Pacific, or Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islanders is we didn't get very many of them in the sample. So when you don't get very many people, you'll see, 3 people can make a large impact on the data, but it doesn't make it statistically significant. Again, what we're seeing here is your younger residents, particularly those between 18 and 34, rate this a little lower. It's that little kind of continuing trend on younger residents haven't quite developed that sense of community or that sense of belonging here compared to the older residents. So that's a theme that's been kind of showing up as we go through this presentation. Another quote from the Mayor's Inclusion Task Force, with becoming very active to encourage people to be active by participating in projects and programs, how that increases the feeling of belonging among the residents who are here. So the survey is telling us a data set. This is being backed up by people who are on the Inclusion Task Force. We have 2 separate sources telling us the same basic piece of information. Regarding how well the city does involving or including people of diverse backgrounds, again, we're seeing that Renton is doing a pretty good job here, specifically when it comes to the openness to include people of diverse backgrounds. If you were to talk about ways to improve upon this, it would be providing additional and equitable opportunities to help people influence decision making. This would be a great topic area to try to dive into, to try to go out and reach to specific residents. We can tell you, who specifically said this, like where they're located and whatnot, but this is a good thing that you guys can dig into and say, what can we do? Because we didn't get the opportunity to ask this in the survey, what more can we do? But what can you do to help make these people feel more heard? Again, there's not negative data here. They're not feeling very poor or anything, but you just have a more so of a neutral feeling, like maybe more could be done. Another quote from the Inclusion Task Force is just talking about how well the city is doing in terms of social justice, equity in terms of hiring. And while this particular person may not have data on it, the survey has some, but we have anecdotal evidence that says, hey, this has started, this has been changing. And we can see that with most people saying that the city is doing a good job, there's some backup there as well. We also talked about a bit about environmental stewardship. And we asked 4 questions pertaining on, how well is the city doing in preserving the environment and protecting open space. The city performed well on all of them, specifically with water. And I recall back in 2017 when I was last giving a presentation that water was a large issue back in 2015 and 2017. We spent quite a bit of time talking about and phrasing the questions regarding water. I don't recall what the responses were. It's something I probably should have looked up before coming here. But it's interesting to see how, whether it's being recognized through efforts the city has taken or just people finally recognizing that water is a valuable resource, that they do feel that there's a lot of stewardship being taken to protect your water resources. Here's some more quotes from the Inclusion Task Force, specifically talking about the efforts taken by the city to create parks, to create open spaces, and to preserve things, and to kind of help residents feel included in that way. So when we talk to residents about the city of, about the Renton Police, we asked a variety of questions, and the one that is in here is we asked about the approachability of police officers. This is a really cool question, right? Because we're basically asking, how comfortable are you approaching police officers? And you're saying that, 77%. So 3 out of 4 people that we spoke to said, hey, these officers are fairly approachable. We feel comfortable approaching police officers. There was some differences by race. When if you look at how it's grouped, we have the Arab American, Middle Eastern, North African, and white Caucasian. They can all basically be grouped together as saying white Americans and white individuals or Caucasians in one way, shape, or form. They do feel more comfortable. So there is a significant difference there based upon race, but we're not seeing a really large difference there. It's not like, Caucasian Americans are saying, very approachable. 77% of them are saying yes, and then 77% of the non-Caucasian are saying no. They're just slightly more likely. So it's a statistical difference, but it's not a huge difference. It wasn't really worth breaking out in this slide because it was just a small difference to be noted. One thing that I kind of found interesting compared to other surveys that we do across the region is about half of residents in Renton have had contact with the police in 12 months. That's higher than we've seen elsewhere in the region. We didn't ask too terribly much about their contact, what it was and what was going on, but I just kind of found that an interesting content, that you have a large number of residents who have had contact with the police and they find the police approachable. So it could be that they've had contact because they find them approachable, or it could be they find them approachable and so they've had contact. It's, we don't have the data to tell you why. Unfortunately, it's always the second question is why. Code enforcement is a big issue in the region. It's a big issue in Renton. About 1 in 5 households have had contact with someone from code enforcement within the past year. About 6 in 10 households say that code enforcement is a minor problem, and about 1 in 5 households say that code enforcement is a major problem. About half, or 4 in 10 households, feel that the city is doing a good job with code enforcement and with property maintenance issues. Emergency preparedness is always kind of a fun question to ask. We ask people how well they feel that the city is and their confidence in the city being able to respond to different type of emergencies. So in this one, we were asking about disaster preparedness. How prepared is the city to respond to a disaster? They get about a neutral rating. And typically when we see kind of a true neutral rating, and when we're asking people to rate things like disaster preparedness or strategic plan or various different things, it's because that they don't really know. They haven't gone through, they haven't looked up what the disaster preparedness plan is, but they just kind of assume that there's one out there. Similarly, in terms of the reaction to the pandemic, 6 in 10 residents feel that the city has done a good job reacting to the pandemic, and this is looking at it through the lens of 2020 hindsight. You're never going to please anyone in terms of how the pandemic was handled, but overall, when you're saying 60% of the households say you did a pretty good job handling the pandemic, yes, there can be improvements, but you did well in handling it. Communication efforts is something that the city has directly under its control. You guys control how you communicate, what you communicate, when and where you communicate. So we do like to ask a lot of questions regarding the communication efforts put forth. 6 out of 10 residents feel that the city is doing a good job of keeping residents informed and providing them timely information. The one area that we would recommend, or 2 areas, I guess, in this case, that we would recommend, is finding a way to engage in two-way dialogue with residents. Asking a survey is great. It gets some feedback, but you have a little bit of static time between what the feedback is being told, how you digest it, and what comes out of this. So residents would like to find a way to have a little bit more two-way engagement, a little bit more two-way involvement. This is not unique to Renton. This is something that we see quite a bit all across every city that we do these in, is residents asking for ways to become more involved, but they're not sure how. They don't know where to do it, so they're kind of looking to you guys or the city as a whole for guidance on this. This quote also holds true in a large degree. Younger people aren't particularly interested in getting involved in community issues. That was me up until about 5 years ago. I didn't really care what was going on. I'm not that young. But we get busy. Right? People have busy lives, and so they may have a thought about what's going on, and then they lose that thought track and get buried down by their kids or their job or whatever. This person brought forth a really interesting idea, and this is not the first place we've seen this idea, which is kind of why we wanted to put it in here. Using the schools and using the kids to bring home information about what's going on in the community, not just in the school district, but in the community as a whole. We've seen this actually over on the peninsula. This was specifically like an open end that brought out and came a large issue in the peninsula, or not an issue, but a large finding in the peninsula was that the schools are a valuable resource for disseminating information that isn't being used as much as it can be. So we saw on the peninsula in Jefferson County. We see it here, and it just kind of speaks to us, which is why we really thought that this quote fit. So now we're going to get a bit into safety. Safety specifically at parks and along trails in this slide, and then we're going to get into safety around Renton during the day, and then safety around Renton after dark on the next few slides. So overall, 6 out of 10 residents feel safe in Renton's parks. About half of the residents say that they feel safe along Renton's trails. We did ask follow-ups behind these, and we'll get to those follow-ups in a couple of slides. When asked about safety during the day, the vast majority of residents say that they feel safe in their neighborhoods and in the landing, and the majority of residents say that they feel safe downtown during the day. At night, as is usual, it's a slightly different story, right? Fewer residents feel safe wandering around at night than during the day. We found that, only about 1 out of 10 residents say that they feel safe walking around downtown alone at night. This is where I wanted to hit back on that perception versus reality. Because as we were talking about this presentation last week, Ryan was mentioning a conversation he had with the chief of police. With the chief of police. Crime statistics are down. Violent crime and crime statistics in general are down from 2017 to now. So Renton is technically a safer place than it was. But the ability to spread information is up. So the perception, when you see on Facebook or Nextdoor or whichever one it is, right, you see someone saying that XYZ happened, therefore your perception of it is happening. So this is one of those differences between reality and perception. It doesn't mean that their perception is wrong, right? People, your feeling, what you feel is a valid feeling. So if people say that they do not feel safe, then they do not feel safe. So perhaps it's a communication effort to let people know, hey, crime is down. Perhaps, as we'll see on this slide, we're going to go back a little bit. One of these, sorry for skipping around, we asked a follow-up on it. And I'm trying to find, we'll find the follow-up in a moment. Okay, so it's right at the very bottom. Perhaps it's just a fear, a perception that there's a fear of crime. We oftentimes see, as is noticed here, insufficient lighting is a big contributor to people feeling safe. We actually asked this question and this series of questions in Maple Valley, and there was a large portion of people who said, I don't feel safe after dark in Maple Valley. And you're going, it's Maple Valley. Lights. They don't have street lights. They don't have sidewalks. People don't feel downtown, or people don't feel safe walking around if there's no sidewalks or street lights. The two commingle. If it's dark, you're afraid that you're going to get mugged. If you can see well, if it's bright, if there's people around, you feel more safe. So the two feed off of each other. But don't think that it is entirely a crime and you have a crime problem. Crime is going down. There's still a perception that there's crime, but there are things that you can do not just by communicating, but by building infrastructure and getting more people out to help people feel safer at night. We asked a cool question. I call it Q-sort, where we present people with 15 different options. And we say, of these 15 items, select the ones that are important to you. And it's a check all that apply. I believe we limited it up to 5. And the top 5 priorities, which are consistent across pretty much every resident, are to provide a safe and secure community, right, to balance the development with environmental protection, to promote a healthy and walkable community, to give home choices or housing choices, and to create some type of entrepreneurship. When I get to this section of presentations, because we ask these type of questions all over, I like to reference Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Right? What people want is they want to make sure that they're going to stay alive. People want to make sure that they're going to have a place to live. People want to make sure that their environment's not going to be destroyed. And then they start to think about things such as community, things such as being able to go out and do and have fun things, experience parks. So when we look at these specifically, after they selected the priorities that they feel are important, we said which one is most important to you personally. So out of the ones that they selected, they then said this is the topmost priority. Safety. Right? That shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. It's the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs for a reason. Everyone wants to feel safe. I did some additional analysis that I was talking to Ryan about last week, where we take a combination of questions about what it is, overall sense of life, quality of services, the sense of community, the direction that the city is headed, etc. And we create an index variable that we use as an overall health metric. And I was out sick for a good portion of July, so I was unable to do this in time for the presentation, but I did it last week. And we use that to run regression analysis. Basically, what that tells us is what are the things that are important and how is the city performing on taking Renton from being, a good place to live to a better place to live. And safety was on there, and safety was important, but it was not the most important thing in terms of taking it from good to great. That was actually housing and community. So when you look at things in terms of do you need your base needs met, everyone needs to feel safe, right? We see this all the time when we ask this question, when we do any type of specific comparison. But when you assume that people's safety needs are met and that they're not being, gunned down in the street or whatever, people actually really want those sense of community, those things to do. Like the landing is a good example, or parks, community events. Those are the things that typically rise to the top when you start looking at what makes it, rather than a place to live, to a place to feel like you belong. Some interesting things that came out of this. So in addition to asking what was most important, we also asked, hey, of those other items you didn't select, what is least important? What was kind of interesting is that, in this specific context, people are like, okay, when compared to safety, when compared to having a place to live, we don't feel like these understanding and celebrating community are great things. But again, when you look at it from the other perspective, which you guys will have the data for this when we're done, I ran it, just didn't have time to put it in here. We're seeing that people really do value and want these things, such as a diverse community and things that speak to them. So as we come near the end, we looked at the challenges that are facing Renton. And the question that was asked was, what do you see as the most significant challenges facing Renton in the next 5 years? We see crime as an important issue, as a big challenge. This is not unique in Renton. Crime, so that if you take the top 4, actually the top 5, actually if you take all of these, as I'm going down looking and reading, you can take all of these and you can look at just about any community survey that we've conducted in the past 10 years. They're pretty much all in the top 5 to 7 problems just about everywhere. So, we're all in this together from city to city. We have our own unique individual challenges, but the big picture problems in terms of making people are safe, they have places to live, they have treatment programs, traffic, always a big one. That's normally the top 3 everywhere. Housing, infrastructure, things related to growth, right? These are the big challenges that your residents see. Some of these, as we mentioned, may be perception-based. Some of them are real. We all know that traffic is terrible, and we all know that we're facing a housing crisis. We all know that infrastructure is an issue. We all know that responding and being able to deal with growth is an issue. So it's really kind of cool to look at this chart and just say, yeah, we know that these are things that we have, and we know that these are problems and challenges facing the cities and communities across the country. We did also ask about contact with the city employees. Another kind of interesting thing here, we have a higher rate of households who've had contact with employees here in Renton than I've seen elsewhere across the region in the country, with about half. About half of households said that they have contacted the city for some reason or another, but they rate the employees really well across the board. So these guys and those guys are doing a really good job. They work hard and they're appreciated not only by you, as I saw when everyone was walking in, but they're appreciated by the community as a whole. So in summary, like if we were to take all of these questions and kind of summarize it and say, where are you doing well? Where are you doing okay? And where can you improve? You're doing well regarding employees. You're doing well regarding reaching out to the different communities and trying to at least make people feel included, being a diverse community. You're doing well regarding your environmental stewardship and taking care of the land that you have. You're doing well with police performance, and you're doing well with people generally feeling safe, specifically during the day. I'm going to go over average. I'm going to go right down to where can you improve. They've been called out earlier. Improve infrastructure, specifically pedestrian and cycle infrastructure. Help with code enforcement issues. And help people feel safer, specifically downtown and in the landing. All of the scores are right here if you want to see numeric data. It's more information than I care to read right now. Are there any questions as we close up?
Sure. My first question, I'm going to go straight to the to the top. And if you covered it when I had to get water, then forgive me. But is this a 5% was a response rate, 652 out of 12,500. Is this a typical response? There's an echo. Typical response rate A, and if it is, why was 12,500 basically 11.7% of the population? Why was that number chosen as the randomized sample? Some would look at this and say 652 out of 170,000. Now, granted, I know people don't respond to the stuff, went straight to the round file, but can you talk about the numbers a little bit?
Yeah. So we'll start with the second question. Why did we pick 12,500? Because that's what the budget could support. Right. For every piece of mail that is, we have to pay for every address that we purchase. When we purchase the addresses, we pay a vendor to do that. They append things such as cell phone number, landline number, email address. So there's a budget involved in that. There's a budget involved in every piece that gets printed and mailed. And of course, every phone call we make, regardless of whether or not it ends up in an actual complete, has a budget line item. So what we try to do is we try to maximize A, efficiency, and B, quality of data that we can get given the budget constraints that we're given. Regarding the number of people who respond, so roughly 5% of all of the households that we reached out to, that's pretty much about average. We see, it does depend a little bit on the size of the community. With larger communities or larger cities, we do typically see lower response rates in that 5% range. But if you get into really small communities, like we'll take Maple Valley since I mentioned them, or Jefferson County, where there's only 5,000 households, right? In those cases, we tend to see more like a 15+% response rate. But yeah, typically when we pull a sample of like 12 to 15,000 records is kind of an average sample size that we pull from. We expect to get somewhere between 500 and 700 completed surveys back. So you guys were right about it. Statistics is weird in terms of your sample size, or your sample size, the number of people that you need to contact, and this margin of error that was mentioned at the very beginning being like plus or minus 3.8%. And I rounded it to 4. The last bullet point on like slide number 4. There you go. So you could have the entire population of the United States, all, 360 million people. And if you were to sample 652 people out of that 350 million, your margin of error at plus or minus 3.8% would be the same. The way that the math works out by statisticians that are way smarter than me is that your margin of error is independent of your sample size. So if you sample 400 people, regardless if it's of a city of 20,000 or a state of 20 million, you sample 400 people, your margin of error is plus or minus 5%. I wish I understood it more than that.
Wait till it comes back around to me to comment on that.
Anybody else? Yeah, please.
Again, thank you for this presentation. This is great information. I really appreciate all the effort that's gone into it. In addition to the demographics of like age, race, were demographics collected in terms of where they lived in Renton? Cannondale versus the Highlands versus Tiffany Park, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes. As part of when we pull down their addresses, it's called address-based sample, we get the specific latitude and longitude of every single record that we had contacted. July was a month where everyone was out sick. So we didn't have didn't have the time during July because everyone was out sick to append that information in time for this presentation. But yeah, we have the latitude and longitude of everyone who completed it. So over the course of the next week or so, we're going to run that through our little GIS program and plug in each of your neighborhoods.
Quickly.
So one thing that I am going to play devil's advocate maybe on the travel in Renton, and you mentioned we have to improve in the pedestrian and cyclist infrastructure. So it says, low 80, easily and safely bicycle where needed. Yeah, I would say that's probably low. Doesn't mean that I would actually bicycle if it was there. And so the conclusion of people want more, I think, is a little, and I understand coming from a cyclist, but I think it's a little presumptuous, of the next step. If you ask me, hey, can you easily buy? I say, nah, not really. But would I, and do most people want to? That would be the question. I mean, that would be I would like to have seen a question. If there was, would you? Mm-hmm. Right. To really actually, if action is going to be taken in this area, it's still 652 people, and I understand the whole significance. I remember stat class way too well. But yeah, the answer doesn't necessarily mean that is the way we should go. And I'm not poo-pooing the whatchamacallit, right. But I want to make that comment and see what you have to say about it.
Correct. I mean, people feel that there's a little bit of room for improvement here, or they rate that lower, but you are correct. It doesn't necessarily mean that people are out there demanding in the streets that you have more bike lanes everywhere. This is one of the questions that we're going to take a look at by neighborhood and by where people live, and we can probably flush a little bit more out of this. We can probably find, hey, people who live over here, okay, well, that's that neighborhood. They definitely could use, or they have been asking for improvements in bicycle infrastructure. That's what our hypothesis is that we'll see certain spikes based on where they live.
Apologies to you and Ryan, by the way.
Gotta respond to that.
We have like 1 minute left.
Oh, yes. My apologies. I appreciate, again, all this. And with the 652 completed surveys, we're going to get the regional. Will we also get the breakdown of who completed it by race and age?
Yes.
In terms of was this proportional to our population?
Yes, we have that information.
Thank you.
In terms of age and gender, it was fairly proportional. In terms of race, we did underrepresent minority populations. We did the best that we could with all of the outreach that we could. We do weight the data based off of I believe I have it all in a table, but we do weight the data based off of the census data. And so all of that information, both the unweighted, the census data that we use to weight, and then the weighted population is all shown. But when we give you guys this information, the results we're presenting are based off of the weighted data.
Thank you very, very much. And we are over time. So really, really appreciate this. It was very informative. Thank you again. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you for putting this together. And we look forward to a little bit more in depth when you get it. Thanks.